This is Beyond with Heather Tesch, where we examine near-death experiences and life itself, hopefully making this life a little better. My guest today is David Bennett. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Heather. It's an honor to be here on Beyond.
Well, thank you so much. And now you're an author, you're a speaker, you're a healer, you're a woodworker, and we will get to all of that. But of course, let's start with your near-death experience that you had in your 20s.
Yeah, in 1983, so going back in time a little bit here, I was the chief engineer of a research vessel, and we were trying to get back to a harbor in California, and we ran into, well, there was a storm, and we were trying to beat the storm in, but we didn't, and the harbor master refused to allow the ship in. So, but we had a lot of engineers on board because we were evaluating a new remote ROV because we did underwater research. And so the captain asked me to help with bringing them in. I'm the chief engineer. I normally don't get in the small boats, but there wasn't we had a really diminished crew while we were evaluating the submarine. So I agreed to go, and we actually went down to the bosun's locker and got some life vests because it was really, really rough. There were 25, 30-foot seas that night. And we put on these old-fashioned Mae Wests, the big, fluffy, looks like a giant pillow, orange pillow.
Yes. And
we jumped in the Zodiac, which is, a vulcanized rubber craft. We use it to retrieve our submarines. It was a very durable craft. We use it in heavy seas all the time. We really weren't all that concerned. And we started heading in. And we took a bearing on the harbor buoy, to navigate in. But you got to realize when we're coming in and we're 2 miles offshore is where the ship was holding station. But as we were coming in, the rollers, we'd have to go up on top of a swell, take a bearing, and then go down the trough and up to the next swell and try to do the same thing over again. Try to keep heading toward the harbor. Well, we lost track of the harbor buoy in no time, but the shoreline was lit up. But it was a storm as well, so it was dark. It was really hard to see. But we just figured, well, worst case, if we miss the harbor, we'll just do a beach landing, and we'll get these engineers off because they had appointments to get to LAX. So we get about a mile from shore, and all of a sudden we find ourselves in a breaker zone, and we actually drove off a breaker and fell about 25 feet. And I yelled to the first mate, turn us around because this is a dangerous place to be. And as he was turning us about, the next one was right there. It came down on top of us. It folded the Zodiac in half like a peanut butter sandwich. I was in the bow kind of trying to navigate a course for us, and it just catapulted me into the ocean along with just about everybody else in the boat. And so I'm an experienced diver. I've clocked thousands of hours as a commercial diver, and so I wasn't all that concerned. Heck, I had a life vest on, right? And so I was just hanging on to Mae West, kind of protecting myself, but I was being tumbled and tossed by the ocean like a rag doll. I mean, I've never felt anything so violent in my life. And as a commercial diver, I know I can hold my breath about 3 minutes max. And it was getting pretty close to the end of my tolerance, and you start thinking about, is my life insurance is okay, this, that, the other thing, kind of regrets, and I'm thinking, is that what happens? I was really calm through this whole thing, but then eventually, the oxygen deprivation comes, you get euphoric, and you breathe in salt water, and I drowned. Well, the interesting thing is, this is, California coast, the water comes out of the north. This is in March. It's very frigid. It's very cold. A roaring sea, 25, 30-foot seas. It's loud. And And suddenly I find myself in this peace, this quiet. I'm comfortable. And I'm like, whoa, this is beyond any oxygen deprivation training I've ever had. And so I just, I was curious. Like, where am I? What's going on? And I saw this light. But I'd like to back up just a minute. In that darkness, a lot of people that talk about near-death experiences will talk about, the void as kind of a scary place. But it wasn't for me because I just died this violent death. And so for me, it was calm, it was peaceful, and it felt like I really wasn't alone. I felt like I was surrounded and embraced. And so when I saw this light, and it was just a pinprick at first, and I felt like I was moving toward it, it was moving toward me. I'm not really sure, but as I got closer, it looked like it was millions upon millions of fragments of light, all in unison. They were all like of one mind, a single mind. And so kind of like if you see a school of sardines, how they all swim together and the light refracts off them, and you see all these multiple colors of light and everything. It was very much like that, only infinite. It was huge. And to tell you the truth, I was in kind of gaga awe of this whole experience. And so as I kept getting closer and closer, I started feeling these waves of love and just like a warm embrace. And I'd grown up in a really dysfunctional childhood, and so this feeling of being enveloped and warmly embraced lovingly was kind of foreign, and but very welcome. And then 3 of the fragments broke away, and they came toward me, and they were welcoming me. And it wasn't a communication that was like you and I are talking right now. It was more of an understanding, a knowing that was deep within my being that I'm being welcomed home. And I still get emotional about it because it was such an amazing feeling to be welcomed home. Because prior to this experience in my growing up, I went from one family to the next to the next. My mom was a single mom when it wasn't popular to be, and she was trying to work and support me. But she would put me in with these families, and then she'd find out, well, this family was doing this and that family was doing that. And so I really grew up not recognizing family. I didn't recognize what that was. But here, these light beings, and I also recognized I had transitioned into a light being, that these beings, and eventually there were a dozen of them, that they were family, and a family I wasn't even aware of, that were there and they were supporting me and loving me. And we went into the light to this one area that felt very spherical, like a giant bubble, and we all went into this, and I started to re-experience my life. And the research calls it a life review, right. But it's more than just a review, because you're seeing your life through your perspective. But it's also like your consciousness is fragmented into these multiple streams of consciousness, and so you're experiencing it from everyone you've interacted with, from their perspective as well. So it's to say
humbling.
Yeah, to say it's humbling is an understatement, and just awe-inspiring that your actions, your interactions with other people, and how it affects them, and how it creates these ripples. And I was a pretty brash young man, and my philosophy was you cut your swath through life. Well, that doesn't leave, that's a survivalist type of mentality, right? Well, so I got to see some of the harshness of my life. In order to become the chief engineer of a research vessel in my mid-20s, I had to step on. I had to kind of forge my way. And so I was experiencing this review, and I realized that this soul family, as I call them, were experiencing it exactly the same way I was. And so I was a little bit, unhappy that they had to experience the harshness of my actions. So, but I also got to see that when I would do something with loving intention, without any, without looking for any kind of reward or anything like that, but I would just do something with a loving intention, that it created some of the biggest ripples, the biggest after effects. So it was just amazing to watch your life and how you actually do affect a lot within your life. So I went through this life review, seeing the good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful, and I eventually got to a point where I was not experiencing. I wasn't really experiencing my life anymore. I'd gone past where I drowned, and I had started viewing more, and so it kind of knocked me off my center a little bit. But my family loved me and supported me, and we kept going. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was actually previewing my life, and so it was different, though. It was different. Everything in the life review up until my death was absolutely crystal clear. All of the actions, the interactions, the ripples, everything was absolutely clear. But when I got past that threshold, it was like there was this corridor, and everything in the central corridor was really clear. But then on the periphery, there were things that were a little out of focus. And so it was like if I wanted to go a little this way or a little that way, I had the free will to do that. But it always brought me back to center. And so I saw things that were part of my future. And it was a little disorienting because I didn't have a foundation for it. So, but my soul family, they just loved me, supported me, buoyed me up, and we kind of carried on. And I finally got to one point where the light, this infinite fragments of light all spoke in unison as one, and I perceived this as God, and it said, "This is not your time. You must return." I said, "No way." I've got a family that I recognize, that I didn't even know I had. I'm feeling love like I've never been loved before. My body is there in that cold ocean, and it's just cold meat as far as I was concerned. And it was like I have no desire to return to that life. Life was hard. It was harsh. And and so I argued with what I perceived as God. And the light spoke to me one more time, and it said, "You must return. You have a purpose." And with that word purpose, I had this understanding. It's kind of interesting when we're in the afterlife, we have an expanded level of consciousness. It's like we're part of all the souls that ever were and all the souls that ever will be. And we have all that knowledge, all that combined information available to us. And when I heard that word purpose, it just resonated within my being, and I totally understood it. And with that understanding, I came immediately to acceptance. And with acceptance, the minute I came to acceptance, the microsecond I came to acceptance, I found myself outside my body, watching my body being tumbled and tossed in the ocean. And there was, and the three original beings who greeted me were with me. And we were watching as my body, the bow line of the Zodiac, had actually wrapped itself around my arm, and the lifeless, the bitter end of the bow line was tapping my lifeless chest. And I was watching this kind of, again, in awe of like, how is the enormity of me, because I was this expansive awareness, going to fit in there, And so I was just kind of like musing about that when another set of waves hit the wreckage. And there must have been a little bit of air left in that Zodiac in one of the pontoons, and it popped it up. And when that happened, it cinched that line around my arm, actually dislocated my thumb, and yanked my arm up and dislocated my shoulder. But I didn't feel anything. I was just observing this from a distance, and it pulled the body up, and it got entangled on the surface with the wreckage. And another set of waves came, and it started pounding my body up against the wreckage, and it forced some of the salt water out. And that's when my soul family, they gave me a gentle push, and I found myself kind of like this vibration back into my body. Whew, well, dying's hard, but coming back to life, that's a trip. So I... you breathe in a lot of salt water, and expelling it isn't pretty. But you really can't talk. And my mates that were on the Zodiac with me, they're the real heroes of my story, to me anyway, because they had stayed on station. They had stayed in this breaker zone looking for me, because that's one of the first things we're trained, is that if we have a problem, that we stick together, we come together, And so they were looking for me, because everyone else was accounted for except me. And so one of them had actually hung on to a flashlight. And my wife now, she likes to joke, yeah, they went to that light, you went to the other light. But it just, there's a lot of funny things that kind of freaked me out about this whole thing. But
God winks.
Yes, God winks. So they found me, because I really couldn't yell back. They were yelling and trying to find me. And this is dead of night in the middle of a storm, breaker zone. And it's not an easy place to be searching. And so I squeaked and squawked enough that they found me. We all rallied together. And then we had a mile to swim, me with a dislocated shoulder and thumb. So I just hung on. But I kept feeling like I was going under. I couldn't stay on the surface. And so I kicked off my, $150 Red Wing boots, which back in those days, that was an expensive pair of boots.
That was, yes.
And I still couldn't stay on the surface. And so that expanded awareness that we feel on the other side was still with me. And I just knew that there was something wrong with my life vest. And I unbuckled it, and I looked down, and the fiber lining of this Mae West was dry rotted and had become super saturated with salt water. It was actually pulling me down rather than bringing me up. And so I discarded the life jacket, and I was able to hang on and help by kicking, and we swam in the last mile. So it was a rough night.
Sounds like it. It's interesting, too, that you didn't want to leave heaven, but then when you got down back to the surface, you really fought to live by swimming all that distance.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is in my mind, I kept thinking purpose. And it was like when I left, when I joined my body, I knew what that purpose was because of that clarity. I understood it, and I had acceptance of it. But when I entered my body, that awareness started slipping away. And so the whole time that I'm trying to figure out how to stay alive, in the back of my mind, I'm going, purpose. What was that purpose? It was slipping away, and I was just mystified by, I know there's a purpose. And so that's what helped me to fight to survive. When I could have gone back to my family. I could have, allowed myself to die again. But that purpose is what kept me focused, kept me wanting to, move on.
Why do you think it's so hard for us to know here on Earth our purpose when it was so clear to you on the other side, and then you get here and you're like, what was that?
I don't think we're meant to know exactly. That's part of the mystery of life. And to me, it's beautiful. It took me a long time to come to where I am right now, this understanding. But because when I got back, I started searching. I started searching for a couple things. One, I tried to understand purpose a little bit, and also anything that had love in the title, because you come back and it's like, wow, I'm really missing that love. That love was so all-encompassing. And so a lot of experiences when they come back, they go on this, they become voracious readers to try to understand what happened to them. Unfortunately, most of the stuff, well, it's getting better. It's getting better because we have so much more ability to communicate now. Like podcasts, like what you're doing here, allows us to, to hear other experiencers, and by listening to other experiencers, a lot of times we learn the vocabulary, we learn, things that help us. But back in the early '80s, I didn't have any of that available to me, so I had to go on this, this kind of quest to try to find out what happened to me, and so in that quest, I realized purpose is, and this is, that was over, 30 plus years ago. So, 40 now, right? So,
right.
Yeah, 40. Yeah. So I was just doing
Time
the math
flies.
in my head. Holy cow, and so what I've learned is purpose. There's grand purposes, that humanity is involved in. And there are small purposes and individual purposes and day-to-day types of purposes where we're put in, like here's an example, like say you just learned something, you studied something, you came to a new understanding, and then suddenly someone comes along who's questioning what you just learned. You're in a perfect opportunity to share and to help another human being. That's a purpose, but it's a small purpose. It's an everyday type of purpose. We also have grander purposes of connecting to our higher consciousness, and that's more of a global purpose that we all share. So purpose isn't an innocuous, legacy that I'm going to accomplish this in my life so much. That can be a purpose, but it's only a single purpose. We have so many multiple purpose in just living our lives.
And how do we, those of us that have not had a near-death experience, discover our purpose? And how do we reach those goals? It's much harder for us, I think.
Yes, it is. I agree. Because before my near-death experience, I was so single-minded, focused on me. I was very self-involved. And these concepts were just foreign, just very foreign. So I would say it's getting in touch with your inner self is the first step. Allowing yourself to quiet, to still yourself enough that you can hear your own higher self, your higher consciousness, your being. Through meditation, there's so many different ways to meditate. I don't tend to point to one or another, but I have some of my own favorites. I love walking meditation. I'm not quite the Zen type of meditator. I don't believe in putting myself in a pretzel position and that sort of thing. I like things that tend to be more natural, because before my near-death experience, I did have some spiritual experiences when I was like 14, and my parents had my mom and my stepfather had moved to Arizona, and we lived in this small community where there was a lot of Native American, and my friend's grandmother saw how dysfunctional my life was, so they taught me some of the spiritual Native ways to try to help me get a grasp on myself. And so they taught me how to vision quest, which is basically a form of meditation. And so I tend to like more of the natural way of meditating, of going inward and finding your guide and finding your essence and allowing that to guide you. And so to this day, I still use that. And another thing that I think helps people in our modern day society is and this is an easier concept when first starting out on this path, is to focus on gratitude, because true gratitude will focus on the good and the bad. You're grateful for everything that's in your life.
And that's tough.
It is. It is. It's hard because, if we lose a job, if we're having, family problems, things like that, it's hard to be grateful. But when you recognize that the good and the bad work together in union, and when you start to step into true gratitude for all that, a sincere gratitude, then you're stepping into a state of grace. It's actually I use it as a precursor into my morning meditation, my morning routine. I use gratitude every morning when I get up. And that is an easy way to start quieting yourself and allowing yourself to still enough to be able to possibly hear your own guidance.
That's great advice. It's sometimes very difficult to appreciate the challenges we face while we're in them. But oftentimes looking back, we can see that is where we had so much growth.
That's right. Hindsight, right? Mm-hmm. It when we look back, and and that's another thing is looking back is healthy periodically, just as long as we don't get stuck there, And living in the present, we hear a lot about modern day spirituality, about being present and being mindful. And those are all amazing tools. And the more that you can explore that, the more benefit you're going to find in your present life. And allowing the future to unfold. That was a huge lesson in my integration of this experience. Because the experience, you come back and you don't accept it right away. At first you think, what am I, nuts? What happened to me and all that kind of thing, and we're human and we have doubts and things like that. But then a lot of experiencers come back with gifts and little things that change their life forever. But focusing on the future, one of the lessons I learned was to allow it to unfold. That was a tough one because I was an engineer. I like to plan things. Mm-hmm. I like to, that was a part of my life. I had a plan. This is where I was going to be by this time, and this is where I'm going to be at that time.
Even when we pray, we go, okay, God, we're going to do this, and then we'll do this, and then this.
Yeah, exactly.
This is how we're going to do it.
This is how we're going to do it, right? And then God laughs at us, right? Because everything's going to happen in the time when it's right.
Right.
And when we find ourselves pushing against what, may not be the path, remember that when I was talking about that central corridor, maybe we've gone a little too far to the right or a little too far to the left, and when we start to push really hard to go in that direction when it's really not meant to be for us, we're going to gently, sometimes not so gently, like a near-death experience. That's not a gentle push. And then you're guided back, to your center. But but when you think about it, when do you grasp for your spirituality? When do we look for God in our lives? When do we look for when we're desperate, exactly, right? So, that's when we've gone too far in one direction. I like to talk about a pendulum. Okay, pendulum swings back and forth, right? Well, think about the pendulum. On one side is your spiritual self, and on the other side is your human self. So your pendulum is constantly in movement, going back and forth between your spiritual self and your human self. And that's healthy, to allow a nice gentle swing. It's when that pendulum swings really hard one way or really hard the other way that we usually get in trouble. And so to try to modify and keep it in a gentle rhythm and to pay attention to, don't allow yourself to be overwhelmed with one side or the other. Try to keep a balance,
Now, David, you said you came back with some gifts, but I found it interesting because I heard you in another interview and in your book, you were saying that you kind of hid those gifts from other people and played them off as other things.
Yeah, when I came back, I suddenly could see auras. And at the time, I didn't even know what an aura was. I never even heard the word. So I called it life force energies because that's what, to me, an engineer, that's what it kind of looked like. And we were in, Southern California at the time and gosh, palm trees are amazing when you can see their aura. And the gardens around, we lived in a very simple apartment complex, but the central courtyard was all gardened and everything, and it was amazing. I could see all these auras and the life energy around my wife at the time. That was my first wife. I just started seeing these things, and it freaked me out. To tell you the honest truth, I was an engineer, and before this experience, I didn't see any of this. And suddenly now this was a part of my world, and it really freaked me out. It was like, whoa, I must have, somewhere in that accident, in that experience, I must have took a really bonk on the head or something, and I was debating whether, do I need to go to see a doctor or something because I'm seeing stuff, And then also what really pushed it even further for me was when I would look into someone's eyes, I would see their light, their fragment of light. I could see it. Because
do you still see the auras, and do you still see light in people's eyes?
I can, but I've learned to turn it off and only do it because it felt so invasive. When I would look into someone's eyes and I would see their light, it felt like, whoa, I don't have permission to do this. I shouldn't be looking at your essence, at your life.
You have permission to look at my life.
But it just so I had to in order to just survive mentally, I had to kind of back off as much as I could until I got a little more control, because it just came on, and suddenly you wake up and you have this. It's scary, and I wanted my old life back. To tell you the truth, it was a little too much for me. I wanted my old life back.
Well, you also gained intuition, and I loved how you sort of played that off on your job.
Yeah, it's interesting. The intuition it ramped up after the experience, and I started having, it felt like nowadays we use terms like downloads or something like this. I would just get this sudden understandings, and it came in different. Sometimes it was about someone, something personal. Sometimes it was about the job that I was performing. I would just know things before I could actually investigate them. And so I like to use the example. There was one job we were on. This is a different job, maybe a couple years after the experience, and I suddenly had a knowing when we were prepping for the job. We were getting the ship ready to go out on this job with all the, the scientists were on board. They had all their demands of what they needed to be able to accomplish, the task with the submarines and stuff like that. But I suddenly had this understanding that while we were out there, we were going to have trouble with one of the engines. I mean, in fact, not so much the engine, but one of the reduction gears. And so I started ordering in preparation for this job. I started ordering parts, and the captain, because I was chief engineer, so I was pretty much in charge of that budget. The captain's like, "What are you doing? That's not standard." It's like, sometimes, and I would cover up, right? This understanding, I would just cover up. Sometimes it just comes with experience. You learn, these things come with experience. And in fact, a few days after my near-death experience, the guys that were in the Zodiac with me, when we finally got together again, they said, "Dave, we were looking for you. A good 15 to 18 minutes was their estimate."
That's a long time.
And it's like, nobody can hold their breath that long. And so I said, yeah, Neptune just spit me back. And so I would come up with kind of cover stories, because the work that we were doing back in, 83, during the 80s, undersea exploration was incredibly dangerous work. And so we put each other's lives in each other's hands every day. And the topic of death was kind of a taboo subject, so you just didn't talk about it. I tried to share it with my first wife, and had a bad reaction. So I felt like this is not something I can talk about. So I tried to deal with it myself, and I went kind of into a self-isolation for 11 years. That But I went into that isolation with, you can't just ignore the experience. It won't let you. So I tried to kind of make an agreement that, okay, what can I accept? And so in that life review, you take a hard look at yourself. And so I came out with acceptance of myself, tolerance, which is not something that I had prior to this experience, tolerance for the circumstances and for other people, because I recognized in that life review that, a lot of people cross our paths and they make decisions for their life, and those are their decisions. And I could be tolerant that that's their life, their life's choices. I don't have to agree with it, but those are their choices. So I learned acceptance for self, tolerance for myself and for others and the situations, and also understanding with tolerance is that you can change. You can change yourself. You can change the situation that you find yourself in. And then the third one, so acceptance, tolerance, and the other one was truth. Because I was an engineer. I saw things pretty much black and white, And suddenly, with these understandings and things that were happening to me, I realized there's a truth that resonates within our heart. That it's not necessarily a truth that we learned in school. It's not necessarily something that we've lived or learned through life experience. But a lot of times we have these truths that when they cross our path, they resonate within our heart. And those truths are guides sometime into direction, that sort of thing. So to pay attention, when our heart starts to sing, when we feel that creative urge and it's pointing us towards something, creativity is the threshold of spirit communication. Where do you think creativity comes from? It comes from our higher consciousness, our higher source. So paying attention to that. So I took acceptance, tolerance, and truth, and I said, I'm going to put the rest of this near-death experience in a box, wrap it up with duct tape, write with a marker on it, do not touch, and shove it as far back into my little tiny brain as I possibly could, because I just couldn't deal with, I argued with God, I have a soul family, the infinite love. That was just, it was too much for this engineer to kind of take in. And I didn't have anybody to talk to about it. So for 11 years, I isolated myself.
And I want to talk about what happened 11 years later, but I also have a lot of questions. So let's take that into part 2. Thanks so much for joining me on Beyond with Heather Tesch. That was part 1. Make sure to listen to part 2. And if you liked what you heard, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe for more episodes.